Good morning, Vietnam. My apologies. I have to add this prologue to part 4 of my HIV/AIDS series, but I'm not going to change the original introduction to part 4. And the reason I'm adding this is because it's actually going to be a 5-part series, because to do both CELIA FARBER'S article and Dr. GALLO'S rebuttal would take far too long. So I've decided to do it in 2 parts, and the first part will be Miss FARBER'S article, and the second part will be GALLO'S rebuttal. Thank you, and here's the introduction as I originally recorded it to follow. Good morning, Vietnam. And here I am back again. And today we're going to do the final episode of my 4-part series on AIDS, HIV, is it a hoax? And if you've watched any or part of my first 3 videos or read the articles I recommend in my descriptions at the beginning of all 3, it means you are interested in to find the truth. And that's all I have set out to do. I must say I have been biased, as I explained in the beginning of part 3, because I never ever believed the way they were describing in the beginnings of the HIV epidemic that there was any truth to it, because it just seemed like total BS. And they were shoving down this new theory down your throat as if they'd already proved it. So today we're going to talk about a great article by one of the great journalists of my generation. She's a little younger than me. And CELIA FARBER. I followed her career from Spin magazine back in the late 80s, where she started writing and researching about AIDS, HIV. And in fact, I kept her articles from the magazine, but like a bit of a fool, I loaned them to my nephew and he lost them. So, afterwards she wrote a number of articles. One of the other great articles was what I mentioned in part 3, was the AZT story, how it was approved by the FDA in record time, and how the makers and the government hid a lot of data that actually showed that AZT is pure poison. But because of the clamoring of the AIDS community, they wanted an instant drug to cure their AIDS. And as I've explained and shown in the first 3 parts, there has been an unbelievable cover-up. Once they said it in April of 1983 that HIV, a new virus, has been found that causes AIDS, then there was no turning back. So Miss Farber wrote maybe her last article on the story, and it's a great article. I'm only going to skim through it. I highly recommend you read every word. And then Dr. Gallo, one of the discoverers of HIV, I'm not even sure if he discovered it at all really in the end, but because he kicked up such a ruckus, even President Reagan had to step in and help him out and convince the French president that they should share the discovery, because that meant CDC and Gallo would get royalties when they finally developed tests and and other drugs. So less than probably 2 weeks after she published her article in Nature magazine, HAPER'S magazine, Gallo and his cohorts wrote a very, very long response and tried to pick apart Miss Farber's article. And I will, for the most part today, pick apart GALLO'S response. And you will see how, again, there's more or less no proof HIV exists in the way and form that they've been selling it to us for 40 years now. And the virus may exist, but we also have another 1,000 more viruses in our body all the time. And that's what cancer is also. It's part of our immunity system that's gone haywire, and viruses in our body start eating up our own body parts and white blood cells, of course. So here we go. I'm going to do the typical thing I've been doing lately, and that is put my notes on the screen and then go through them. If I did the whole thing, it would probably take 3 to 4 hours, but I'm going to skim through Miss Farber's article, but I highly recommend again to read every word. It's a fantastic piece. Okay, see you in a few seconds. So as I added in the prologue, it has to be a 5-part article now, and this will be part 4A. Miss Farber's article in Harper's magazine in June of 2006. So you can see now, as I said, 5 parts. I'm just including, excuse me, exactly what I discussed and read in part 3. So I'm just including this for people who maybe did not hear me in part 3, if they want to read this. And this is just a copy of the beginning of part 3. So now we start on the part 4A. One of the first main statements that Miss Farber makes in her reference 1 is how being in a different country actually determines if you have HIV. As I have stated in the beginning, and almost all of the parts in this series, in Africa, almost all of Africa, there are no blood tests required or done to determine if you have AIDS or HIV. Yet it is considered Central and Southern Africa to be the epicenter of HIV infection. So we'll get to reference 1 in a minute. But before that, I'm including in the next 2 pages, just to show you again how disgusting the narrative and the writings have been. The first one was written months before Montagnier published his discovery of AIDS, but this CDC article already is claiming to be an epidemic on an analysis of, I believe, if I recall correctly, about 1,000 people. The article, I know, is totally misanthropic, it's so racist and biased against people with drug habits and haemophilia. The only thing they have in common, of course, is their immunity system is totally compromised and that they are probably dying. The acronym HIV was not even published yet, but here it is in the description. And it was only recently thought of as HTLV, or part of the family of viruses of HTLV, and almost all the references in this article are actually from CDC themselves. And both these articles were actually discussed in more detail in part 1. But I just put this in here because since I even recorded part 1, I've read many more articles and just find some, especially these two, some of the most disgusting that have ever been written about anything. So this CDC article, March 1983, actually I think it was written in 82. But anyway, it's the Big 4-H Club: haemophilia, homosexual, heroin users, and Haitian people, especially men, of course. And if you look at some of the references, as again most of them from CDC themselves, they really have no data of any size to back it up. There's a handful that they refer to and talk about, but no research done to prove anything they say. So here's some quotes, and again there is almost zero data to back anything they say in this article. So you can see here, recently 11 cases of unexplained, life-threatening, opportunistic infections, and this opportunistic infections are going to detail in part 3, and cellular immune deficiency have been diagnosed in patients with haemophilia. Yes, because their immunity system is totally shot. Again, I've made this statement so many times in this series. Available data, as I just said, it is so small, the data, suggests that the severe disorder of immune regulation underlying AIDS is caused by a transmissible agent. Zero proof. Zero goddamn zero proof. Another lie, of course. The distribution of AIDS cases parallels that of hepatitis B virus infection, which is transmitted sexually and parenterally. I just can't believe they can make these statements without backing it up. And the second article is actually as late as, it's only 10 months ago, July last year, and almost everything in this article is a complete and absolute lie if you have any doubt about what HIV is, and even if it exists. So I've highlighted in blue what I think is a complete lie. As I said, I've gone through these articles before, but here I've just highlighted in blue what I think is absolute disgusting lies. And if you take out HIV out of this article, it just simply reads how to prevent any disease, especially sexually transmitted diseases, and how to lead a healthy life. I just put in here the reference to Dr. Gallo's article, which I will get to in the next video. So here's the Harper's Magazine article, finally, we are getting to after about 10 minutes. And it's called Out of Control, AIDS and the Corruption of Medical Science. And it came out in March of 2006. So Ms. Farber starts off, and this is really a testimonial to how things go absolutely wrong, crazy, because no one follows and does the logical thing in trying to protect this woman, Joyce Ann Hafford's life, even though she has zero chance of having HIV. The doctors who forced the HIV test on her, secondly, did not tell her that pregnant women can show false positives, and we'll get into that in greater detail when I debunk the article by Dr. Gallo trying to debunk the same statement. from this article here. Anyway, the doctor recommended that she do a HIV test, as I mentioned. Her obstetrician, I mean, what does she know about HIV that she should do a test anyway? But the woman was scared, of course. As soon as the word HIV was mentioned, she did the test, she was positive. And all the articles that talk about doing a HIV test, always, everyone says do 2 tests, minimum. But they never did the second test on her. And of course, they told her, well, you might as well do the drugs because it'll be healthy for your child if you do have HIV. But she was never exposed to anyone even close to who could possibly be HIV positive anyway. And what she didn't know was that, as I highlighted here, that she was referred to a specialist, but actually what they were doing was recruiting patients for clinical trials on HIV and AIDS. And this was within the NIH. So the object of the trial was to compare the treatment-limiting toxicities of 2 anti-HIV drug regimens. Well, she never agreed to any trial. She never really agreed to anything, as we'll find out in a few minutes. So they gave her a combination of AZT and lamivudine. This trial was a safety trial as well as an efficacy trial, which means that pregnant women were being used as research subjects, in other words, guinea pigs, to investigate the safety. And yet the trial was probing the outer limits of bearable toxicity. And of course, as Ms. Farber writes, post-1994, AZT was hailed for cutting transmission rates from mother to child. And it actually, we will find when I debunk Dr. Gallo, this is an absolute lie in itself. So they tried to get 440 pregnant women to do this test, to participate in these trials. So this was what's called a Category C trial, which means its safety to either mother or fetus has not been adequately established. So of the 4 drugs in the trial, 3 were Category C, which means the safety to either mother or fetus has not been adequately established in the first place. So Ms. Hafford was 33 years old, had always been healthy, never any major illness. She showed no signs of any of the clinical markers associated with AIDS. And her CD4 counts, which is the so-called golden rule about if you have HIV, were in the normal range. But in June, she was enrolled in the trial and she took her first dose in June 18th and she felt sick immediately. She had a rash, she had welts all over her body. It was the first sign that there was a major problem. They told the doctor and he said to put some hydrocortisone cream on it. Her sister, quote, is talking now. I later learned that a rash is a very bad sign, but they didn't seem alarmed at all. She was, Miss Hafford was on the regimen for 38 days. She became more and more sick. She was in total pain. So they didn't even tell the mother of Miss Hafford that she was on this HIV test and of the trial itself. And poor Miss Hafford thought this was all caused by her being pregnant. And it's been recalled or quoted from Miss Hafford, "I have got to get through this. I can't let my baby get this virus." She never had the virus. And in fact later, but she never expressed any fear because she thought that this was going to keep her baby from being HIV positive. And of course, she was really, really sick and getting more sick, and they did nothing. Her blood was drawn for lab tests, and she was not taken off the study drugs, according to legal documents and internal NIH memos. 8 days later, she was considered fully symptomatic. It appears obviously to me that she was dying. Her liver was completely, almost totally shot, and she had acute renal failure, anemia, septicemia. I mean, she was finally taken off the drugs. So, what was it, July? So anyway, she was on for 38 days, and then she finally had to deliver the baby because poor Miss Hafford was dying. And she remained conscious long enough to hold the baby. So around 40 days after she started the regimen, she died. And one of the doctors said to them, Miss Hafford's mother or sister, that you got a lawsuit. But then when they finally did file a lawsuit, they couldn't find this doctor anymore. So the family wanted to do an autopsy, but they didn't have the money to do an autopsy, so no autopsy was done in the end. There was a liver biopsy, however, which revealed, according to internal communiques of DAID staff, that Hafford had died of liver failure brought on by nevirapine toxicity, in other words, the HIV drug, main drug. And of course the other drugs as well. They told us how safe the drug was. They never attributed her death to the drug itself. Then what did she die of? She was in perfect health when she came into the hospital. And they told her AIDS must have progressed rapidly. But Joyce Ann Hafford never had AIDS or anything even close to AIDS. The family knew there was something wrong, but at that time they didn't have the financial resources to do the autopsy or to take it any further at that time. So, reference 1, as I mentioned in the beginning, As I've mentioned in the first three, or some of the first three parts of this series, HIV tests detect footprints, never the animal itself. These footprints antibodies are identified by means of molecular protein weights and were limited to 2 in 1984, when the first test was developed and patented, but over the years expanded to include many proteins previously not associated with HIV. And as I've said many times, they keep widening the goalposts on everything to do with HIV. Like most Americans, Harvard thought that a single HIV positive test meant that she had HIV, a surefire death sentence. But a majority of HIV positive tests, when retested, come back indeterminate or negative. In many cases, different results emerge from the same blood tested in different labs. There are currently at least 11 different criteria for how many and what proteins at which band density signal positive. The most stringent criteria, 4 bands, are upheld in Australia and France. The least stringent, 2 bands, in Africa, where an HIV test is not even required as part of an AIDS diagnosis. The US standard is 3 reactive bands. It has been pointed out that a person could revert to being HIV negative simply by buying a plane ticket from Uganda to Australia, or from the US to Australia. So to continue from the article, the son, who has been raised by her sister now, they gave ACT to him for 8 weeks after birth. And the other thing, they have not released the baby's medical records. And now they've been told that he's HIV negative. They never had any evidence that he was ever born positive. Now, I don't know where this statement comes from. All babies born to an HIV positive mother are born positive, but most become negative within 18 months. So I assume the immunity system within pregnant women create this certain viruses that either are there to protect the mother or to try. The mother is going through so much because of being pregnant that the same virus or proteins are passed on to the baby, and if you test for so-called HIV, they test positive. But as the babies get stronger and get older, and the immune system gets stronger, they become negative automatically. Of course, no one has admitted any liability about the toxicity of the drugs that Ms. Harvard died of. So they only found out that she died from the toxicity because of an AP reporter, John Solomon, sent the family the report. So they filed a $10 million lawsuit against the doctors, the Tennessee Medical Group, and St. Jude's Children's Hospital, Research Hospital, and the drug manufacturer. Of course, no one's commenting on it. So, finally on this matter, Ruby King, her sister, made a final disturbing discovery when she was going through Harvard's medical records. In addition to discovering that her sister had only ever been given a single HIV test, she also came across a 15-page consent form, which was unsigned. Now, I tried to look up what happened with this lawsuit, and I can't find anything. So I'm going to keep looking for it and try and get it for the next episode on the rebuttal. So now we get on to maybe the biggest part of this article, which is a study on the same drug that killed Miss Hafford, and cocktails, some of the other drugs that also caused Miss Hafford's liver to fail, and that is started in 1997. They started similar cocktails, drugs, on pregnant women in Uganda. And Miss Farber goes in great detail. She's a fabulous researcher. She goes on for pages and pages. I'll just try and only read my highlighted parts. But I've written here, sounds like the top secret research name from the Terminator. I don't know if you recall in the second part, the second movie, where they were developing this technology from the Terminator 1 robot, and they called it something so similar to HIVNet. I can't quite recall. So we'll take a pause to continue. The internal communiques from Dades around the time of Hafford's death made it clear that doctors knew already that she died of the HIV drug, nevirapine. So Dr. Fishburne sorry, I have to go back. So Fishburne was a doctor, director of the Office of Policy for Dades, wrote an email to his boss, and his boss emailed back saying, "Ouch, not much we can do about dumb docs." I assume he's referring to dumb doctors for killing the patient, and nothing about the drug itself. So the same AP reporter, John Solomon, got hold of this email and broke the story, and that Fishburne was trying to seek whistleblower protection. So as I just said, the internal communiques from days around the time of Hafford's death made it clear that doctors knew she had died of nevirapine toxicity. Tramont's reply to Fishburne suggests that he thought blame could be placed squarely with Hafford's doctors, but it was the NIH itself that had conceived of the study as one that tested the treatment-limited toxicities of HIV drugs in pregnant women. This so reminds me of the thalidomide drugs that were developed in Germany back in the 50s and 60s, which I've mentioned a couple of times already. That the drugs weren't tested. Thalidomide wasn't tested on pregnant women, but when pregnant women took it as an anxiety pill, they had stillborn babies and deformed babies, and because it was never tested on pregnant women. And this is what this research was trying to do, is test the toxic reaction on pregnant women, and they're trying to hide this whole test and research by doing it in Uganda. And it says here, as I've illustrated in red, 4 of the women in the nevirapine group developed hepatic toxicity, liver disease. So there's another example that Ms. Farber brings up, Ms. Terry Schiavo, if you'd like to read more about it. But soon a chorus of condemnation was turned against those who were sensationalizing HAPER'S death, and the growing HIVnet controversy to condemn nevirapine, which had been branded by the AIDS industry as a life-saving drug and a very important tool to combat HIV in the third world. What about the first world? And of course, the AIDS activists, pro-AIDS activist community were all up in arms. They didn't really care if some people died. They just wanted the drugs because they wanted the drugs they thought they would save their own lives. And there was do-gooders who, like Elizabeth Glaser. But Elizabeth Glaser was also funded by the company that made nevirapine, Boehringer Ingelheim. They donated $1 million to her AIDS foundation. And they put out this statement, which is absolutely disgusting. This was no scandal, but simply part of a landscape. Pharmaceutical companies fund AIDS organizations, which in turn are quoted uncritically in the media about how many lives their drugs save, never about how many lives are actually lost. And of course, as I've mentioned, the government got involved. And of course, you know, if I may say, dumbass Bush couldn't find his own ass. If you ever listen to him talk, I mean, it just shows you about the dumbing down of America, how they can elect anyone like Bush, and it just gets worse now with Trump, of course. Anyway, he got involved and pushed the drug because CDC or NIH told him to. So Africa has become the ground zero of the AIDS epidemic. Of course, you're never even tested or blood tested for HIV anyway. All to do with funding. Money, money, money. So as I said, there's different definitions of if you have AIDS in Africa. So even as far back in 85, the definition requires neither a positive HIV test nor a low T-cell count, as in the West, but only the presence of chronic diarrhea, fever, significant weight loss, and asthenia, as well as other minor symptoms. These happen to be the symptoms of chronic malnutrition, malaria, parasitic infections, and other common African illnesses. In 1994, it was suggested they should use HIV tests, but in practice they are prohibitively expensive. So, as I've indicated here, many diseases that are endemic to Africa, such as malaria and TB, are known to cause false positives. In this muscular can-do era, we are particularly prone to the seductions of the pharmaceutical industry, which has successfully marketed its ever-growing arsenal of drugs in the latest American right. Buzzwords: access, of course, which short-circuit the question of whether the drugs actually work, let alone if HIV exists. So now she goes on and talks about it also depends on how much money you have, what medical insurance you have, if you can even afford the drugs. As I've said in part 3, AZT was, when it first came out, was $8,000 a year. So who has that sort of money if you're poor? And if you're poor, you don't have health insurance anyway. So then the only way to get treated is to go on these trials. So as she writes, such studies help maintain the industry's carefully cultivated image of benign concern of charity and progress. As this woman, Vera Hasna Sharab, writes, I call them what they are, human experiments. What's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is that profits in medicine shifted from patient care to clinical trials, which is a huge industry now. Everybody involved except the subject makes money on it, like a food chain. At the center of it is the NIH, which quietly, while people weren't looking, wound up becoming the partner of industry, pharmaceutical industry, of course. So, by June 2004, NIH registered almost 11,000 clinical trials. So that means they had to buy the drugs from the pharmaceutical companies. Wow. Going back to Dr. Fishbein. So he's one of the good guys. So he'd overseen and consulted on hundreds of clinical trials. So there was already talk about what was going on in Uganda. Something about Uganda, that's all I knew. And a big one that had been plagued with problems. He was told he would have go, no-go authority over individual trials. It wasn't long before Fishbein realized that he was in effect taking a job that was equivalent of piloting an already airborne plane. They had all these trials going on and hundreds of millions of dollars flowing every year, but there was apparently no one in a senior position there who really had clinical expertise, who knew all the nuances, rules and regulations in the day-to-day running of clinical trials. So when Fishbein went to DEBUNK in 2003, they were doing 400 experimental trials, both in the US and abroad. So there was already red flags. So I don't know who she is. You'd have to go back and see. Project officer. I'm really frightened about the stuff that goes on here. She's referring to the African study. Has been racked with problems and completely lacking in regulatory standards. She told Fishbein that the trial investigators were out of control and that there was no oversight of them, and nobody with either the inclination or the authority to make them adhere to safety standards. And of course, which I remember quite clearly, What Fishbein subsequently learned entangled him in a story with eerie echoes of Jean le Carré's Constant Gardener. I'll let you read her article. I'll only comment on her reference 5. Asked to comment about the Hafid case and the larger nevirapine controversy, Boehringer Ingelheim, the makers of the drug, provided the following statement. Viramune was an innovation in anti-HIV treatment as the first member of the non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor class of drugs. Now in its 10th year of use, Viramune has been used as a treatment in more than 800,000 patient years worldwide. The only problem is, where is all the data for these 800,000 patients? And as I mentioned in the part 3, that they had to shut down that transgender clinic in England because they didn't do the follow-up work and kept the records of what was going on with the drugs they were giving the young children, teenagers, and not taking into account their emotional stability on giving them those type of drugs. Of course, they've hushed that up very well already. And so where is all this data for these 800,000 patients? How many died? Died of what? How many autopsies were done? Zero information. So they're doing a major trial study in Uganda where the benevolent dictator had opened his country to the lucrative promise of AIDS drug research, as well as other kinds of pharmaceutically funded medical research. It was intended to be a 4-arm phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trial. And I reference this as GALLO 3 as part of his rebuttal, which we'll get to in the next video. So, Ms. Farber, in her reference 6, talks about randomization, drug testing, placebo controls, phase 3 drug trials, what they all mean. And she's claiming here, which Dr. Gallo disputes, right here in the beginning, this was supposed to be a 4-arm phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trial. In fact, as she states here, a small phase 1 trial preceded that studied the safety primarily of nevirapine in pregnant women, but also looked at efficacy. It was called HiveNet 006, and it enrolled 21 pregnant women for initial study. Of 22 infants born, 4 died. There were 12 serious adverse events, 12 out of 22, more than 50%. The study also showed that there was no lowering of viral load in the mothers who took the study drug. So the drug did nothing for their so-called viral load. Didn't make them better at all. In fact, there was 12 serious adverse effects from taking the drug. So the main trial was supposed to be 1,500 infected Ugandan women. How do they know they're infected if they didn't do blood tests? At a minimum. So this talks about the size and how much of the drug they would take and when they would take it. The study was to last 18 months, and its primary endpoints were to see how these two regimens would affect rates of HIV transmission from mother to child, and to examine the proportion of infants who are alive and free of HIV at 18 months of age. One of the exclusion criteria was participation during current pregnancy in any other therapeutic or vaccine perinatal trial. In other words, if you came to this trial, you could only take the only thing you can do is take the drugs they're prescribed, and you can't take any other drugs or be helped in any other way. So, although HivNet was designed to be a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind phase 3 trial of 1,500, it wound up being no placebo, neither double nor even single-blind phase 2 trial of 626 mothers. Virtually all the parameters outlined were eventually shifted, amended, or done away with. All together, beginning with perhaps the most important, the placebo controls. By a letter of amendment dated March 9th, 98, the placebo control arms of HivNet were eliminated. The study was reconstituted, thus amounted to a simple comparison of AZT and nevirapine only. So these are the results. Supposedly, the data proved stunning. And as they quoted in the Hopkins Medical News, it showed that nevirapine was 47% more effective than AZT. But the article also reported that 38 babies had died, 16 in the nevirapine group and 22 in the AZT group. So 38 and 16 is 54 from 600, so about 8% of the babies died. How many also had any other complications? And of course, best of all, nevirapine was inexpensive, just $4 for both doses. With the results of the study now published in The Lancet, Boehringer, which previously had shown little interest in HivNet, now pressed for FDA approval to have nevirapine licensed for use in preventing the transmission of HIV in pregnancy. Of course, some cases finally become aware that it is a life-threatening liver toxicity. The American Medical Association warned against using nevirapine for post-exposure treatment after 2 cases of life-threatening liver toxicity were reported among healthcare workers who'd taken the drug for only a few days. One of them required a liver transplant. So in another report, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, highlighted an additional 20 cases of serious adverse events resulting from fairly brief nevirapine post-exposure prophylaxis. Serious adverse events were defined as anything life-threatening, permanently disabling, or requiring prolonged hospitalization. The Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report stressed that there are probably more unreported cases, since the reporting by doctors to MedWatch is voluntary and passive. In other words, they don't have to and only will do if you're asked to. So Boehringer applied to FDA to get it approved, all based on the HivNet HIV-NET study in Uganda To its credit, the FDA decided to go to Kampala, inspect the site and review the data itself. But Boehringer panicked and they went to the Uganda site to see what was going on before FDA did. They were the first to discover what a shambles the study was, and yet they applied for FDA approval. Problems also were found in the management of the trial drug and in informed consent procedures. One of the main problems was a loss of critical records. One of the two master logs that included follow-up data on adverse events, including deaths, was said to be missing as a result of a flood. So nobody knew anything about the tests and the research. Drugs were given to the wrong babies. Documents were altered. It goes on and on. The company called Westat that did the research and the test, the Westat auditors looked at a sample of 43 such infants, and all 43 had adverse events at 12 months. Of these, only 11 were said to be HIV positive. How do they know? So, HIVNet team changed the logbooks and all the data. And in one case, a stillbirth was reported as a grade 3 adverse event for the mother. In other words, it died naturally. So this is all about the cover-up now, which I won't get into. Please read. Without attempting to verify accuracy, Westat also discovered that half the HIV-positive infants were also enrolled in a vitamin A trial, which effectively invalidates any data associated with them. So, of course, DAIDS, the NIH, and Boehringer asked for a postponement, and FDA wanted to see the report immediately. So, in South Africa a few months later, the news focused on the angry chorus of AIDS experts and activists speaking as one. So, studies show nevirapine given to HIV pregnant women during labour and to their newborn babies can reduce HIV transmission of up to 50%. So they're quoting the initial report, which was so full of holes, inaccuracies and lies, but because of the activist chorus, they don't really care. They want it approved. The problem with such statements, of course, is that the study in question was precisely the one that established the claim that nevirapine cut HIV transmission. But the ways in which the various players were tethered together, in other words, NIH and Boehringer and the company that was paid to manage the testing, but the ways in which the various players were tethered together made it impossible for DAIDS to condemn the study without condemning itself. So Ms. Farber cites, in reference 7, continually doubting this whole pregnant women, transmission of HIV from pregnant women to their babies. Family Health International, the NIH contractor, originally responsible for monitoring HIVNet 012, contested the Westat report and said that the results of the study had been validated by the NIH and the Institute of Medicine. Yeah, but it's like the fox guarding the hen house. But Dades was well aware of what transpired. So they're saying it doesn't matter because in Uganda things are different. So even though the report was so bad, there is no question about the validity of the results. The problems are in the rather arcane requirements in record keeping. Dades was so dismissive of the Westat report that Westat's lawyers eventually put officials on notice that they were impugning Westat's reputation. So, getting back to dumbass Bush, he announced $500 million program to prevent maternal transmission of HIV, in which nevirapine therapy would play a major role, despite the fact that the drug has never received FDA approval for this purpose. So they then went on a path to reconstitute and revalidate the report. And they rewrote it. And they substantially rewrote the report, especially the safety section, minimizing the toxicities, deaths, and record-keeping problems. The rewritten report concluded that nevirapine was safe and effective for the treatment of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, but, of course, thus saving HibNet 012 from the scrap heap of failed scientific studies. So, God forbid, they still didn't have FDA approval, so Tremont, who was the head of DAIDS, who had previously signed off on the safety report, ordered a new version to be drafted, essentially retracting the previous one and sending it to FDA. And NIH shut down any discussion and prevented any of its researchers from talking publicly about anything that happened in Uganda. And of course, once the government got involved, 15 billion African AIDS program. So Bush even visited the site in Kampala. Jesus. So now it all started to become personal within the NIH, especially DAIDS. As reference 9, at this point the story grows even more complicated as Fishbein supported Luzar in a sexual harassment claim against Kagan. So it was going back and forth and no one was going to back down. But of course, Tremont, Kagan and Tremont tried to terminate Fishbein's employment. Of course, get rid of the rabble-rouser. And DAIDS officials wrote emails in which they worried about how to fire him, that's Fishbein, without creating repercussions for NIA Director Anthony Fauci. I actually thought he was one of the good guys from COVID-19, but it turns out he's just as much of a schmuck, asshole liar for letting this report get changed, covering up Uganda, and allowing nevirapine to be approved by the FDA. So one of the emails Tremont wrote to Kagan: John, let's start working on this. Tony Fauci will not want anything to come back on us, so we are going to have ironclad documentation. So the web now includes several more NIA employees who weighed in with suggestions about how to best expel Fishbein without leaving damning legal fingerprints on the proceedings. So there was an active campaign to humiliate me, he says. It was as if I had AIDS in the early days. I was like Tom Hanks in Philadelphia. Nobody would come near me. Just like that movie, The Fugitive. They killed the doctor was getting too close to the truth about this new drug, so they killed his wife and tried to blame him for her murder to shut him up. And of course, the government washed its hands of it and didn't do anything about the complaints from Fishbein. The panel ignored Fishbein's evidence that Dates had covered up the study's failures and relied on testimony from the HIV net investigators and NIA officials. Not surprisingly, it found that HIV net's conclusions were valid. 6 of the 9 members on the panel were NIH grant recipients, with yearly grants ranging from $120,000 to almost $2 million. Of course, Fishbein dismissed the IOM report as whitewash. So now they're going to give awards for the people who covered it up. So I don't know if they actually gave the award to these guys from this email that that Kagan sent to Tremont. As I said, they told all their employees to shut the F up and not to talk about any of this. The first question is single-dose nevirapine a safe and effective drug for the prevention of mother-to-infant transmission of HIV? Fishbein has said that due to the spectacular failures of the trial, the answer to this is not known and not knowable. Fishbein believes that ultimately the HAPER'S affair is not about nevirapine or even AIDS, but about the conduct of the federal government, which has been entrusted to do research on human beings and to uphold basic standards of clinical safety and accuracy. Of course, National Institute of AID, of course, says it's totally safe. And as Ms. Farber writes, the multiple studies line, as I have indicated in so many of the research papers I have questioned and debunked, they use this multiple studies line so many times. Let's read this. Sir, while raising concerns about standards of record keeping in the HIVNet 012 trial in Uganda, in your news story, activists and researchers rally behind AIDS drug for mothers. You overlook a great flaw. None of the available evidence for nevirapine comes from a trial in which it was tested against a placebo, in other words, control groups. Yet, as the study's senior author has said, a placebo is the only way a scientist can assess a drug's effectiveness with scientific certainty. But this is too late. Once they've approved the drug, what are you going to do? As we noted earlier, HIVNet 012 trial abandoned its placebo group in early 1998 after only 19 of the 645 mothers randomized had been treated, under pressure of complaints that the use of a placebo was unethical. So now we get into, she talks more about the effectiveness. Without supporting evidence from a placebo-controlled randomized trial, such statements seem unwarranted. The question should not be, is nevirapine better than AZT? Is nevirapine better than nothing? Independent evidence suggests that it is not. So there's another study done in Malawi, and all they did was give them vitamin A. Again, the whole problem I find in all this is, how do they know they're HIV positive if they don't do full blood tests anyway? Another study was done in Kenya. Why all these? It's quite interesting to me that all these studies are done in Africa, where you can easily hoodwink mothers, especially to thinking that they're doing something good for their child. So this study, she replied in a quiet voice, almost a whisper, "Our results show that nevirapine had little effect. I actually felt it was a waste of resources. HIVNet was just one study, but usually before you apply it in a field setting there should be a few more studies to see if it works in real life. What I think they should have done is wait for more studies before they launch this in all these countries." When I asked her how she explained this, she replied, "Well, I want to be careful. There seems to be an industry now." Yeah. How much money can you make on killing poor African women and their babies? As Ms. Farber writes, the failure of the HIVNet researchers to properly control their study with the placebo group is not as unusual as one might think. In fact, this failure is perhaps the outstanding characteristic of AIDS research in general, as I mentioned a few times. So she goes on about AZT. And they were supposed to have this control group back in '86, but for some reason they dropped the control group and they put everyone only on AZT. Subsequently suggested that data tampering was widespread. Documents were altered, causes of death were unverified, and the researchers tended to assume what they wished to prove. That is, the placebo group diseases were AIDS related, but that those in the AZT group were not. Yeah, well, AZT. You can look at Ms. Farber's full report in part 3. As she writes here, It is therefore an extremely efficient cell killer. So she gives her definition of a HIV as a retrovirus. Let's assume that it exists a way some scientists have said. I am not so sure that it is a retrovirus. But I agree with this statement. AZT prevents the replication of HIV by killing infected T cells. Unfortunately, it kills all dividing cells indiscriminately, whether they are infected with a retrovirus or not, and will very quickly decimate even a healthy person's immune system. AZT's manufacturer, GlaxoSmithKline, chose not to comment for this article. AZT was approved in record time. Anti-HIV drugs such as Crexivant were approved in as little as 6 weeks. The HIVNet cover-up can be understood within the larger political context of AIDS. AIDS helped turn disease into politics, and politics, at least in the United States, is all about turning power into money. Now she talks a bit about Dr. Duisberg, which I mentioned extensively in the last, part 3. And he became such a scapegoat for everything wrong with people complaining about HIV. You knew he was wrong before you knew what he had said in the first place. So exactly the same with HIV. People accepted it without doing the research. And once that ball got rolling, there was no one there to push that stone back up the hill. So, as I've said, he's published a few articles, and more extensively his publishing is in that 8th article, the Denialist article on Wikipedia, which I mentioned in the last, part 3. Duisberg argued that retroviruses don't cause cancer, and concluded by detailing how and why the retrovirus HIV cannot cause AIDS. As AIDS grew in the 1980s into a global multi-billion-dollar juggernaut of diagnostics, drugs, and activist organizations, whose sole target in the fight against AIDS was HIV, condemning Duisberg became part of the moral crusade. Subsequently, his NIH funding was terminated, and he has received not one single federal research dollar since his pre-1987. And he has claimed and asked to test his hypotheses that AIDS is a chemical syndrome caused by accumulated toxins from heavy drug use. So she goes on to see how he was totally crucified and victimized. And what was it exactly that Peter Duisberg had done? He simply pointed out that no one had yet proven that HIV is capable of causing a single disease, much less the 25 diseases that are now part of the clinical definition of AIDS. So reference 12 is what I've talked about, that I don't think Gallo discovered HIV. I think it was Montagnier. So She goes on a lot about Duisberg here. I've highlighted in red, and I highly recommend that you read it all carefully, and you'll see, I'll only read the first sentence. He pointed to a number of paradoxes regarding HIV and argued that far from being evidence that HIV is mysterious or enigmatic, these paradoxes were evidence that HIV is a passenger virus. In other words, we have these in our body all the time anyway. So she goes on to talk about, well, Duisberg's theory about viral loads, etc. Anyway, viral load, one of the clinical markers for HIV, is not a measurement of actual live virus in the body, but the amplified fragments of DNA left over from an infection that has been suppressed by antibodies. Another embarrassment for the HIV hypothesis is the extraordinary latency period between infection and onset of disease, which I've mentioned already. Despite the fact that HIV is a biochemically most active within weeks of initial infection, this latency period, which apparently grows with every passing year, enables proponents of the theory to evade Koch's third and fourth postulates. Unbelievable how some scientists throw logic out the window. As I highlight here, when it comes to AIDS, basic scientific standards seem to no longer apply. Reference 13. It has been claimed that HIV somehow causes cell death even when it is not present by remote programmed suicidal mechanisms. So she goes on to explain about how it kills T cells, interesting here. HIV does not sicken or kill chimpanzees, though they do produce antibodies. It was recently claimed that HIV appears to be evolving into a form less dangerous to human beings. Such unproven hypotheses about the ingenuity of HIV proliferate in the popular and scientific media like the seasonal flu. Seldom do journalists insist on good hard evidence for these assertions. See, it's going to disappear soon. That's my prediction. They'll stop talking about HIV. She goes on. I'll try only read the highlighted part. AIDS is a syndrome defined by 25 diseases, all of which exist independently of HIV. As I said right at the beginning of part 1, no one has ever demonstrated the cell-killing mechanism by which HIV is supposed to cause all these different diseases. The overwhelming character of the evidence for HIV causation has always been epidemiological, which is to say a correlation, a coincidence. Given that the evidence for HIV is coincidental, a number of research avenues suggest themselves, yet orthodox AIDS researchers have failed to demonstrate that the incidence of AIDS defining diseases is higher among individuals infected with HIV than among the general uninfected population. So you can make the case HIV is a harmless passenger virus, which Duisberg has said from day one. And no one's explained the fact, and as I said earlier, I think part 3, that the HIV positive Americans have remained constant at around 1 million since 1985. But if people remember the news, the mainstream media, the way they were talking about AIDS and HIV, it was going to become an epidemic greater than what happened with COVID-19. And as many people now, reputable scientists have said, many cases, I am saying 99% of AIDS are the consequences, 90% of AIDS are the consequences of heavy drug use, both recreational, poppers, cocaine, methamphetamines, and medical AZT. In other words, the drugs are killing you. So she cites, which I have already discussed, about Kaposi sarcoma, and we'll talk more about it in part in the rebuttal with Dr. Gallo. Again, no study about, nor have control studies been carried out to prove that hemophiliacs infected with HIV die sooner than those who are not. Even Luc Montagnier, who discovered HIV, has stated repeatedly that the virus cannot cause AIDS without contributing causes. And that's what I've always said. You don't die of HIV, you die of your immunity deficiency going haywire, and you die of things like TB or even herpes or pneumonia. This is what they write about Peter Duesberg. Peter Duesberg has the blood of African AIDS babies on his hands. Duesberg is evil, a scientific psychopath. He should be in prison. AIDS denialists, as if skepticism about the pathogenicity of a retrovirus were the moral equivalent of denying that the Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews. Moral zeal rather than scientific skepticism defines the field. It has been decided in advance that HIV causes AIDS. And AZT was a magic bullet. It never ceases to amaze me. Do any research on AZT, and it's pure poison. And she does refer to President Mbeki of South Africa, as I did extensively in part 1, how he refused to never believed that AIDS was caused by HIV. Even Jonathan Fishbone, which we talked a lot about above, who never questioned the premise that HIV causes AIDS. Even he was tarred and feathered for pointing out that the NIH flagship study on nevirapine was a complete disaster. In the end, NIH failed to silence Fishbone. He won his case and was retroactively reinstated at the agency, though he won't be returning to DAIDS. He is unable to discuss the terms of his settlement. Of course, God forbid, this is what happens. Peter Duesberg has been less successful, though there are signs of rehabilitation. So, please read. Many scientists live in fear of losing their funding. Nobody is safe. One NIH-funded researcher told me, the scientific medical complex is a $2 trillion industry. And this says former drug developer Dr. David Raznick, who now works on nutritionally based AIDS programs in South Africa. You can buy a tremendous amount of consensus for that kind of money. And of course, Gallo in the next part really puts down Dr. Raznick personally. Before the biotech boom, we never had this incessant urging to produce something useful, meaning profitable. Everybody is caught up in it. Grants, millions of dollars flowing to laboratories, careers, and stars being made. The only way to be a successful scientist today is to follow consensus. Duisberg has never been afraid to challenge consensus, but contrary to what many in the age establishment would have us believe, he is very far from being a scientific psychopath. And as in reference 16, 2,300 people, including Nobelists in chemistry and medicine, have been very skeptical about the approach of HIV and AIDS hypotheses. So as she writes in 2005 in this article, Duisberg went back to Germany in 1997 and has been working on cancer research and has developed a whole new theory about cancer. And because his work is so important, he's been quietly invited back and given a lecture, and a lot of very important people showed up to the lecture. And after the lecture, another doctor, I asked him about the AIDS controversy. AIDS is a political thing, and Peter's stuck in it. There's nothing to discuss anymore on that. Bialy made a critical point. Science is amoral and should be. There is no right and wrong, only correct and incorrect. Duisberg is a classical molecular biologist. All he is interested in is rigorously testing dueling hypotheses. The twin pillars, AIDS and oncogenes, both are crumbling because of the questions Peter Duisberg put into motion. Anyway, she talks about his research on cancer now. As I said, he's being invited back in the fold because his research has become so important. So he, as I mentioned, he did a lecture in 2004, it looks like, or 2005 in May, and the Cancer Institute invited him to talk at the NIH, and the top people in the cancer field did show up and listened to him talk about his new theory on cancer. And after the talk, while Duisberg remained at the podium talking to a group of people from the audience, I noticed a very angry-looking NIH publicist standing in the back of the room admonishing a colleague, a scientist, who'd posed a question that somehow connected a new ploidy to HIV. This is Duisberg's new cancer theory. You opened it up, she scolded. We got through it okay, but you opened it up. As the questionnaire tried to defend himself, a thick-set man who'd been standing in the circle said loudly, as though intending to broadcast it across the room, well, at least if he's wrong about this, he won't be killing millions of people. Nobel laureate Kerry Mullis, who discovered the DNA technique called the PCR, polymerase chain reaction, has long been supporter of Duisberg, but he has grown weary of the AIDS wars. Look, there's no mystery, sociological mystery here. It's just people's income and position being threatened by the things Peter Duisberg is saying. It's really hard for them to deal with it. They made a really big mistake and they're not ever going to fix it. They're still poisoning people. Duisberg thinks that up to 75% of AIDS cases in the West, I think it's higher, can be attributed to drug toxicity. Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about different drugs. He's talking about the drugs they take to HIV patients. If toxic AIDS therapies were discontinued, he says, thousands of lives could be saved virtually overnight. And when it comes to Africa, he agrees with those who argue that AIDS in Africa is best understood as an umbrella term for a number of old diseases, formerly known by other names, that currently do not command high rates of international aid. The money spent on antiretroviral drugs would be better spent on sanitation and improving access to safe drinking water, the absence of which kills 1.4 million children a year, let alone giving them food so they don't starve to death. As Miss Farber concludes, it's too late to save people like Joyce Ann Havett, but it is possible that an open and honest debate about the risks of current AIDS treatment and the scientific questions concerning HIV could save others. So Harper, the magazine, writes that they will feature responses, but I haven't found any responses. And in my next video, I do Dr. Gallo's response, or he tries to debunk almost everything that Ms. Farber has said in this article, but I can't find any responses to the responses. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you read this article in full, and see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.